the chat. And so moving on to our next speaker, we have our last speaker today is Louise Dyson from the University of Warwick. And so we're going to end this first half-day session of our research meeting in a similar way to we began. We're going to be talking about education, which of course has been a really big topic throughout the pandemic. And I think Louise is going to focus more on the work that she's been leading on in Warwick with regards to the schools, rather than might focus on universities. And so with that, I will pass over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much. We'll do the hard sharing screen bit. Okay, so hopefully that works. Thank you. I'm sorry that I had to move later. Mike and I had planned a great double act, but it's a double act sort of now, framing the whole day. So where Mike was talking about universities and sort of more data-driven schools work, I'm going to talk about modelling COVID-19 in schools. And all of this work really was very much led by Tristan Leng, who is here, and I expect gave a what are they calling them? Lift talk.
So he's giving one tomorrow. Yeah.
Okay. So he'll also probably tell you about this tomorrow. But it's very much his work, although a collaboration of lots of people that I will show at the end. And if you're interested in other work that Warwick has done, this is our website at the bottom. It contains more or less up-to-date information about all the different things that we're doing. So this work really started as we kind of came to the end of last year, and schools were kind of preparing to return after lockdown. And the government was considering lots of different kind of testing strategies they could use. So they had kind of bought a load of lateral flow tests, and the question is, what are we going to do with them? Can we do something that will reduce transmission in schools and allow more kids to kind of be in school? So the kind of pre-Christmas strategy was that whenever a student tested positive on a PCR, they were in these kind of bubbles, and others in that bubble then would have to isolate for 10 days. And the proposal was to move to a strategy where instead of isolating for 10 days, those other students in that bubble that had not tested positive but were in the same bubble as somebody else that had tested positive could, instead of isolating, take daily lateral flow tests for 7 days. So every morning you would take a lateral flow test, and you were allowed to go to school if it was negative. And obviously if it was positive, then you were not allowed to go to school. So this isn't quite what ended up happening, but this was the kind of, this was the inspiration for the project. We wanted to see what would be the effect of that strategy. And it's kind of clear that it's likely to increase transmission because you're taking people who probably aren't positive, but might be, who were at home not transmitting, and saying they could go to school if they have a negative lateral flow. So they're probably not going to transmit, but it could be that your lateral flow gives a false negative, and that means that you can go to school and you can transmit. So you're kind of increasing transmission a little bit, but you're reducing the number of days of school that the students are missing. And we wanted to investigate what was the effect of that change. So we took a model, because that's the kind of people that we are. So we have a discrete time, stochastic, individual-based model with a daily time step. So what does that mean? So we have schools with 5 year group bubbles. So they're quite large bubbles. And this is because at this point, it seemed like most schools were essentially taking the entire year as a bubble. And we're kind of thinking about this as a secondary school. So the year groups are relatively large. And then we say that people can mix randomly within their bubble, and they can kind of transmit to each other. We've got a sort of assumed incubation period and infectiousness profile. So you get infected on some day, and then your infectiousness kind of grows and then decreases again. And at some point you may develop symptoms if you're going to develop symptoms. In the baseline model, we didn't have any transmission between bubbles. We've kind of relaxed that a little bit now. And we have a constant external force of infection, which is essentially infections coming from outside of school. Yeah, and then we have some assumptions for asymptomatic people. And this is really the crux of the matter. So you don't need to worry too much about all the different lines on these plots, but the main idea is that you get infected on some day and your infectiousness grows, and then you kind of, your immune system takes over and you become less infectious again. But as this happens, also your probability of testing positive on either a lateral flow test or a PCR test goes up. So at the time we were doing this, there were lots of kind of arguments about whether lateral flow tests were insufficiently sensitive to be used for this kind of thing. Because if you give somebody who is infected a PCR test and then a lateral flow test, it may well be that that person is positive on the PCR test and negative on the lateral flow test, even though they are infected. So in some sense, the lateral flow test is less sensitive than the PCR test. However, when you look at these profiles, you see that that varies a lot over time. So particularly towards the end of your infection, you're a lot more likely to test positive on your PCR test than you are on your lateral flow test. And the idea is that that's kind of okay because it's late in your infection and you're not very likely to be infectious at that point. So at the peak of your infection, your lateral flow test is maybe slightly less likely to be positive, but they're really quite similar. So you're still quite, the lateral flow test is still pretty sensitive, so long as you're testing at the right time in your infection. So we're kind of putting all of this information into the model so that you can think about, well, when you test, will have an effect on this outcome. So if I test negative on my lateral flow test this morning, the chance that I become infectious by this afternoon is fairly small, whereas in 10 days time probably doesn't make much difference. Okay, so we have lots of different strategies here. And if you look on the medRxiv version, you'll find that we have changed things a little bit. We're revising, so there will be an update to the medRxiv papers at some point quite soon. We've added in this strategy, which is twice weekly mass testing and isolation of year groups, which is what they actually kind of did. So what strategies do we have? We have isolation of year groups. So this is the kind of pre-Christmas strategy. We've got this twice weekly mass testing with isolation. That's what they actually did. We have this serial contact tracing, which is what I was talking about. So if your bubble mate tests positive, you can take lateral flow tests and still go to school. And then you might have weekly mass testing without anything else, and you might have a combination of weekly mass testing plus this kind of serial contact tracing. So this sort of encompasses the main results, really. So we're plotting on the x-axis here the total number of, well, the total percentage of the school population that are infected by the end of half term. So we'd like to be on the left where we have less infection. And the mean school days missed per pupil. So we'd like to be at the bottom of the y-axis. So really we would like to be in the bottom left-hand corner And you can see that this policy that they had pre-Christmas in orange here results in a lot of school days missed, but does reduce infection compared to the blue serial contact testing or the purple weekly mass testing. And if you do both serial contact testing and weekly mass testing, you reduce infections even further. And what they actually did reduces it even further than that, but also increases the number of school days missed. Okay, so these plots are really just going along the two axes. So you can see here that indeed there are a lot more school days missed per pupil for these two strategies where we isolate year groups, and all the others are much, much lower. But it does have an effect on the total number of people that are infected by the end of the half term. And you tend to find that the combination strategy does pretty well. It reduces infections, and it doesn't mean that you end up missing lots and lots of days of school. So what's the downside? The downside is you're testing them lots. So you're really testing your school population lots and lots over time. The number of lateral flow tests that you're giving each pupil is really quite a lot, and that's not great from the point of view of you have to pay for all the lateral flow tests, but even more so, it means that you're kind of making your kids stick things up their noses lots, and that's not ideal. And of course, it all depends on people participating in the program. So the more uncomfortable things are, the less likely it is that people will take part. So ideally, one would not have to test that much. Whereas you can see for what they actually did, it was a lot lower. But the combination strategy identifies a large proportion of your asymptomatic cases. So as soon as you're doing something where you're kind of testing people every week, then you're much more likely to find people that aren't symptomatic. Whereas, of course, the previous strategy would only have discovered people that developed symptoms and went and got a PCR test. Okay, so this is all very well, but that was not really fitted to any data. And so our the next thing we did was to go and look at some data. So the model has changed a little bit because we have allowed some transmission between different kind of groups within the school. And we fit a bunch of parameters. So we fit things like essentially the within school R0, kind of how much does the alpha variant increase transmissibility? How much does community infection affect the school? Yeah, so we've got a kind of bunch of parameters that we're fitting. So we're only fit up to alpha, essentially, and we stop before we get too much delta, because there was a point where you have to stop. Okay, so I'm grateful to Leon for describing what SGTF was. So we use the S-gene target failure data to estimate the percentage of cases that are the alpha variant. We have that by lower tier local authority, which are all of these regions. We know the number of PCR positives by LTLA and lateral flow test positives and negatives. We know the daily number of confirmed cases within each school and the daily number of school absences from each school. And we fit all of this to get the parameters in the previous slide. And it fits pretty well. So here the black dots are the data and the purple line is the model, and the grey background is whenever you have kind of school closures or holidays. So you can see that things were kind of taking off essentially as the alpha variant came in. We had kind of decrease during lockdown, and then we sort of start to, out here we start to get into Delta land and we stop. So the model lets us estimate the proportion of infections that are coming from essentially child to child transmission versus those that are coming from outside into the community, from the community into the school. So the blue line is everything, and the red line are cases that we estimate to come from community transmission. And you can see that there are a reasonable number of infections that are happening on top of the community transmission, but the R value within school is below 1, really right up until kind of the end, when we have both alpha and the schools start to kind of relax their measures a little bit, and it starts to get a little bit dicey. So we have a bit that might be above 1 here, and of course then we go on and we haven't looked at that bit. So one thing we can do with this is to think about the kind of counterfactual scenario. What would have happened if we had done a different set of measures within schools? So what we did is this purple line. So we have mass testing and we isolated close contacts, and you can see the data here sort of fits reasonably well. So this is school days missed, and all of the other measures kind of reduce the number of school days missed at the cost of increased numbers of cases. So the one I like is mass testing and serial contact tracing testing. So testing contacts of, so you take a lateral flow test every morning, where you can see that the kind of the school days missed is very low, and although it does have higher infections, it's not massively higher. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about. So we have this model, and we've used it to look at lots of different kind of strategies for testing. We find that a combination strategy works really well in terms of not increasing the number of cases massively, so kind of keeping the cases under control, but also meaning that you're not missing large amounts of school, but it does mean sticking lots of things up kids' noses, which is not ideal. So we then fitted the model to the data that we have, and prior to the emergence of the Delta variant, we find that R within schools is mostly below 1, and that mass testing and isolation did reduce infections, but at the cost of keeping some kids at home from school, which is not ideal. So these are the 2 papers. I put the link in the chat before I started. And these are all the people, and this is Tristan, who you will see tomorrow, and is great. And if you ask me questions I don't know the answers to, I will hope that he might help me out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. So does anyone have any quick questions for Louise before we? So I did have one, Louise, if no one else is going to put the hand up. And it's, oh, so Raphael's asked someone a question. When you calibrated the model, did you continue to use a constant external infection force of infection, sorry?
Yes, that's a good question. So it's not constant, it then scales with infections in the community. So we know the kind of PCR positivity in each LTLA, and we can scale that by an essentially constant amount. So it's sort of linked to what's happening in the general pandemic.
Great. Raphael says thank you. So just squeeze in, if I can, just one question before the panel discussion, and that's kind of on the model structure and in particularly sort of context. So you had a lot of parameters there that you were fitting. So for example, I saw there was one related to a scaling factor for rural schools, things like that. So I guess you know, if you could pick whatever data you wanted, what data on contact structures within schools and, you know, potentially variations between different schools would, you know, have really helped make this work, it improved your predictions and improved our understanding of what exactly is happening within schools?
Oh wow, that's
really quite an open-ended question.
But that's a very hard question. Yeah, I mean, I guess we would really like to know things about sort of what proportion of contacts happen essentially within bubbles to outside of bubbles. So we didn't have a lot of information about what individual schools were doing with their bubbling policy, but we also kind of, it's quite hard to know, you know, if you have a school and it's got maybe it's got year groups and then it's got classes within those year groups, you know, to what extent do children in different classes within the same year group have contact with each other, and to what extent do children within a year group have contact with other children outside of those year groups, and then like outside of school. So all of this sort of internal makeup is quite unseen and we're kind of inferring.
And so in your model, you're inferring that, are you basically by fitting the parameters, so fitting like the R value within school and things like that? Is that how you're?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much, Louise. That was really great talk and great to hear the work they're doing. So I'm just going to stop the recording now.